Henry Lewis, a 42-year-old millionaire, seemed to have it all. He had wealth, power, and status, everything he could have ever desired. Yet despite all his success, there was one thing his money couldn't buy: an heir. He needed a child. But Henry didn't want a traditional family. He didn't want love or emotional entanglements. He had tried that twice, both times ending in failure. His first marriage had been to a woman who only cared about his wealth, and the second had been filled with constant emotional drama and disappointment. He no longer believed in love. It had caused him nothing but problems. Make sure to subscribe to my channel so I can continue bringing you more fascinating true stories like this one. And don't forget to watch this video till the end and like the video because this story is going to be incredibly interesting. Please hit the like button to show your support. For Henry, a child wasn't about love. It was an investment, a continuation of the empire he had built, a legacy to pass on when he was gone. It didn't have to be about a relationship or love. What he needed was simple: a contract, no strings attached. He knew he could easily find someone to carry the pregnancy for him. He didn't need to worry about complications or emotions. It would be a transaction, and he would have complete control. The next morning, Henry drove his sports car through the city streets, his mind set on finding someone who would accept his offer. He wasn't interested in a woman who wanted a relationship or a family. He needed someone who would see the opportunity for what it was, a way out of their current situation. As he stopped at a red light near downtown, something caught his eye. On the corner of the sidewalk, a young woman was sitting on the ground, drawing on a piece of dirty paper. Her brown hair fell messily over her face, and her worn clothes showed the strain of living on the streets. Despite her appearance, there was something captivating about her. Henry found himself staring at her, intrigued by how absorbed she was in her drawing. She didn't seem to care about the world around her. He tried to ignore her, thinking she was just another homeless person. But as the light turned green, he couldn't help but glance at her again. Something about her presence nagged at him. Who draws on the sidewalk like that? He thought, but the image lingered in his mind. Annoyed with himself, Henry sped away, dismissing the thought. But just a few blocks away, he found himself pulling over to a parking lot. The image of the woman kept bothering him. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, but his gut told him he had to find out more. He couldn't shake the feeling that she was somehow connected to the solution he had been searching for. He turned the car around and drove back to the corner. There she was, still sitting on the sidewalk with her paper, unaware of his return. Henry stopped his car, rolled down the window, and called out, "Hey, you! Come here!" The young woman looked up, her eyes narrowing as she studied the well-dressed man in the sports car. She didn't move, her gaze suspicious. Henry's tone remained firm. "I'm not asking. Come on, I don't have all day." After a long hesitation, she slowly stood and walked toward the car. Her thin frame and the wear on her clothes became even more apparent as she approached. But there was something about her posture, the way she carried herself, that suggested resilience. When she reached the car, she stood still, her voice low but firm. "What do you want?" Henry looked at her for a moment before speaking. "Get in. I'll take you somewhere. We can talk." She gave a dry laugh. "I'm not one of those, if that's what you're thinking." Henry frowned, annoyed by the assumption. "Don't be absurd. I don't have time for that. I just want to talk. Now get in the car, or you can keep living on that sidewalk." Her hesitation was clear, but Henry's tone left no room for argument. Finally, she opened the door and slid into the car. The silence between them was thick, but Henry didn't seem to mind. He drove toward a quiet cafe away from the bustle of the city. Once there, they sat at a corner table. Henry didn't waste time. "What's your name?" he asked. The young woman hesitated before responding. Leah Parker." Henry nodded as if processing the name. Then, without preamble, he got to the point. "Leah, I'm offering you something that could change your life. I want you to carry a child for me." Leah blinked in confusion, unsure if she had heard correctly. "What?" "I want you to have a baby for me." Henry repeated, his voice cold and direct. "I'll cover all your expenses during the pregnancy, and when it's over, you'll receive a large sum of money, enough to never have to worry about anything again." Leah stared at him, processing his words. "Are you joking?" "No," Henry said firmly. "This is serious. I don't want a relationship, and I don't want emotional drama. I want a child, nothing more. It's a simple transaction. You carry the baby, and I pay you. Afterward, the child is mine." Leah couldn't believe what she was hearing. What kind of man makes an offer like this to a stranger? "The kind of man who knows what he wants," Henry answered. "And I don't waste time. You're in a position where you need help. I'm offering you a way out, no strings attached." Leah's mind raced. She was homeless, struggling to survive each day. The offer was tempting. No more living on the streets, no more worrying about where her next meal would come from. But at what cost? Giving birth to a child and then walking away from it? It seemed impossible. "Why me?" she asked, her voice uncertain. Henry's gaze was unwavering. "Because you're in a position where this is your best chance. You don't have anything, and I'm offering you everything you need." Leah felt a knot in her stomach. She didn't want to believe him, but she knew deep down that he was right. She didn't have options. And maybe, just maybe, this would give her a chance to escape the life she had. "I'll need time to think," she said quietly. Henry nodded. "You have 24 hours. After that, don't bother contacting me." Leah sat in silence, absorbing his words. She was faced with the biggest decision of her life. What would she choose? "Leah Parker, but why does it matter?" she replied, her eyes narrowing with suspicion as she kept her gaze on him. "Because I need to know who I'm dealing with," Henry answered, his voice calm but firm. He leaned slightly forward, observing her carefully. "Tell me, Leah, why do you sit on the sidewalk drawing as if nothing else matters?" Leah shrugged, avoiding his eyes. "What else is there to do? I have nowhere to go. I've lost everything. But that's none of your business." Henry took a deep breath, his posture remaining straight and commanding. He rested his elbows on the table, locking his eyes onto hers. "I'll get straight to the point. I want to make you an offer, something that can change your life." Leah's brow furrowed as she tried to figure out where this was going. "And what would that be?" she asked, her voice cautious. "I want you to have a child for me," Henry stated flatly, not blinking. Leah blinked, taken aback by his words. "You're joking, right?" "No, it's a serious offer," he replied. "I'll cover all your expenses during the pregnancy, and I'll give you full support. When the child is born, you'll receive an amount of money that will ensure you never have to worry about finances again." Leah let out a nervous laugh, her arms crossed defensively. This has to be some kind of joke. What kind of man makes such an offer to a stranger? "The kind of man who knows exactly what he wants," Henry said. "I don't want a relationship, Leah. I don't want emotional drama. I just want a child. Simple as that." Leah stared at him as though he had completely lost his mind. His words rang through her head. "I want you to have my child." She couldn't wrap her mind around it, but something in Henry's expression told her he wasn't joking. His cold, methodical demeanor made it clear he was absolutely serious. Despite her disbelief, she felt the weight of his words, and it left her torn between holding on to her dignity and the harsh reality of her life. "This is madness," Leah finally muttered, breaking the silence. No woman in her right mind would agree to something like this. Henry didn't look away from her, his posture remaining as calculated and controlled as ever. "No woman in your position would refuse," he replied bluntly. "I'm offering you a way out, comfort, stability, a new life, in exchange for something you already have, the ability to bear a child." Leah crossed her arms, struggling to maintain some resistance, but deep down, she knew Henry was right. She had nothing left. Every day had been a struggle just to survive. But the idea of giving up something so personal in exchange for money twisted her stomach into knots. "And then what?" she asked, her voice filled with doubt. "What happens after the baby is born?" "Once the baby is born, you'll receive a substantial sum to start your life over. No strings attached," Henry explained. "You'll be free to do whatever you want." Leah let out a humorless laugh, shaking her head. "And how do I know you won't change your mind and drag me into court later?" Henry studied her with an almost clinical detachment. "Leah, I'm a businessman. I don't enter into agreements without ensuring all parties benefit. You'll have a legally binding contract, one that neither of us can change afterward. I'm not a fool." Leah sat in silence for a long moment, absorbing his words. The idea of security, even if only temporary, was tempting. She had nothing now, not even a roof over her head for the night. The thought of having enough money to never worry about survival again was something she hadn't imagined was possible. But she knew she was on the verge of making a decision that would change her life forever, one that would alter the course of everything she knew. "What if I say no?" she asked, leaning slightly forward, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside. Henry gave a faint smile, his gaze unwavering. "Then you go back to the streets. You'll keep scraping by, facing the cold and the hunger. The choice is yours." His words landed with the force of a slap. She wanted to hate him for being so blunt, but deep down, she hated the truth in his words even more. He had backed her into a corner, leaving her with no easy way out. There was a part of her that wanted to tell him to go to hell, to reject his offer outright. But the reality was that she didn't have that luxury. Henry was right. She had nothing left, and this might be her only shot at escaping her current life. Leah paused, her mind racing as she weighed her options. The proposition was beyond anything she could have imagined, yet she knew it was the reality of her situation. A way out, money, stability, a fresh start. But at what cost? Finally, there was one last question she needed to ask. "Why do you want this, Henry? Why not just adopt a child or find a woman who's willing to have your child the normal way?" Henry's expression didn't change, but his eyes seemed to soften slightly. "Because I want a child of my own. I want someone who's a part of me, my blood. Adoption doesn't give me that. And I don't want the complications of a relationship. What I'm offering you is simple, a contract. No feelings, no emotional ties, just a child, that's it." Leah sat there stunned into silence as she tried to process everything he had said. The harsh reality of her life was slowly being replaced with a chance at something better, but it came at a price. Was she willing to make such a sacrifice? She sat back in her chair, staring at Henry. She had spent too long in the dark, and now she was being offered a glimpse of the light. It was a painful choice, but maybe it was the only choice she had left. Henry leaned back, waiting for her decision, but he knew that his offer was the only escape she had, and whether she accepted it or not, he would have control over the situation, just like he always did. "Why are you doing this?" Leah asked, her voice trembling with disbelief. "A man like you, with all your money, why not adopt a child or find one of those wealthy women who love showing off their perfect kids?" Henry leaned back in his chair, taking a slow, deliberate breath. His tone became colder, more serious. "Because I want something that's mine, an heir of my own blood, and adopting or getting involved with someone in my social circle brings complications I'm not willing to deal with. I want control, Leah. Nothing more, nothing less." His bluntness shocked her, and she quickly looked away, unsettled by his honesty. As much as she wanted to reject him, she couldn't deny the truth in his words, and that made her feel more vulnerable than ever. After a long pause, she managed to steady herself and said, "I need time to think." She wanted to regain some control over the situation, but deep down she knew her options were limited. Henry nodded, as if he had anticipated her response. "You have 24 hours. After that, don't bother contacting me." He stood up and walked toward the door without a glance back. Leah watched him leave, feeling as though she was being pulled into a whirlwind she might never escape. Outside, the cold air hit her like a wall, and Leah's thoughts began to race. Henry's offer, comfort, stability, a new life, kept echoing in her mind. She had been living on the streets, struggling every day for survival, and now she was being offered a chance to escape all of it. But at what cost? Her mother had always said that opportunities only knock once, and it was up to you to decide whether to seize them or let them slip away. The decision weighed heavily on her. Having a child, even as part of a deal, was a monumental decision. But what if it was her only way out of the endless cycle of misery? Leah sat on a park bench, staring at the gray sky, trying to make sense of everything. Her heart pounded with uncertainty as she thought about her future. Could she accept this offer? Was it worth it? Meanwhile, Henry sat in his luxurious living room, reviewing the contract his lawyers had prepared. It was a detailed agreement, everything laid out with precision, the terms clear and binding. He hated the waiting, but he knew Leah didn't have many options, and if she turned him down, he'd simply move on to someone else. No emotional attachment, no complications. That was how he liked things. The intercom broke his thoughts, and he answered. "Leah's here," the receptionist informed him. "Send her up," Henry replied, his tone neutral. Minutes later, the door opened, and Leah stepped inside. Her tired eyes met his, but there was a determination in her gaze. "I accept," she said, her voice firm and decisive. Before Henry could speak, he stood up, observing her closely. "Great. Let's make this official," he said, motioning toward the table where the contract lay. Leah walked over, her heart pounding as she looked at the document. She read through it carefully. The conditions were clear. She would receive full support during the pregnancy. All her expenses would be covered, and when the baby was born, she would receive a significant sum of money to start over. In exchange, she would relinquish all rights to the child. "This seems final," she murmured, her voice quiet but filled with uncertainty. "That's exactly what I want," Henry replied, his eyes watching her intently. "And I hope it's what you want, too." Leah hesitated, taking a deep breath as she picked up the pen. Her fingers trembled slightly, but after a long moment of thought, she signed her name, sealing the agreement that would change her life forever. It wasn't just a transaction, it was a new beginning. But at what cost? The moment she signed, Henry's assistant, Stephanie, appeared at the door, ready to escort Leah. "Let's get you settled," Stephanie said, her voice warm but a little too cheerful. It felt like a stark contrast to the coldness of the contract Leah had just signed. Leah followed Stephanie out to the waiting black car, her mind still processing everything. As they drove toward Henry's mansion, she glanced out the window. The city that had once felt like an overwhelming maze now seemed to offer a different possibility. For the first time in a long while, Leah thought she could see a way out, a chance to start over. Stephanie glanced at her, sensing Leah's hesitation. "You'll like the place," she said, trying to reassure her. "It's quiet, spacious, and most importantly, comfortable." Leah didn't respond. She was still too deep in thought. What had she just signed herself up for? Was this really the right choice? When they arrived at the mansion, Leah's eyes widened in shock. The towering iron gate opened, revealing a sprawling estate surrounded by perfectly manicured gardens. In the center stood the mansion, an imposing marble and glass structure that looked cold and sterile, much like the man who owned it. It was grand and overwhelming, nothing like the small, worn-down apartment she had left behind. Stephanie led her inside, and as Leah crossed the threshold, she was immediately struck by the opulence of the place. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceilings, and the furniture looked as though it had come from an expensive design magazine. Everything was pristine, but there was a coldness to it, an air of detachment that reminded her of the contract she had just signed. She wasn't here as a guest, she was here as part of an agreement. "Your room is ready," Stephanie said, her voice warm but still carrying the edge of business. "It's one of the best suites in the house. Let me show you." Leah followed Stephanie down the hallway, her footsteps echoing in the silence of the mansion. The room she was led to was vast, larger than any place she had ever lived in. A king-sized bed with luxurious linens, floor-to-ceiling windows with views of the gardens, and a bathroom so large it could be considered a small apartment. It was beautiful, but it felt hollow. She wasn't sure if she could ever feel at home here. Stephanie left her to unpack, and Leah sat on the edge of the bed, staring out the window. The weight of her decision crashed down on her as she thought about what lay ahead. She had made the choice, but now she was left wondering if it had been the right one. Stephanie led Leah inside, and as they walked through the house, Leah barely had time to process the overwhelming luxury around her. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceilings. Wide marble staircases gleamed under the soft lighting, and the furniture looked as though it belonged in a high-end design magazine. Everything was pristine, elegant, and immaculate, but it made Leah uncomfortable. This wasn't her world. At least it didn't feel like it. It was beautiful, but it didn't feel real to her. For now, it was the reality she had to face. But she knew that this wasn't the life she had imagined. "I'll show you to your room," Stephanie said, smiling in a way that didn't quite reach her eyes. "It's one of the best suites in the house." Leah followed in silence, the weight of the situation pressing heavily on her chest. When they arrived at the room, Leah's eyes widened. The bed was enormous with soft linen sheets, and the floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking view of the garden outside. The bathroom was larger than any apartment she had ever lived in. Marble counters, deep soaking tubs, and everything that screamed luxury. But despite the lavish surroundings, Leah felt out of place, as if she were simply passing through someone else's life. "If you need anything, just call me," Stephanie added as she turned to leave. "We're here to take care of you." Leah sat down on the edge of the bed, running her fingers over the smooth fabric of the sheets. It was surreal. Just yesterday, she had been sleeping on cold sidewalks, her body exposed to the harshness of the elements. And now, here she was, surrounded by comfort, luxury, and warmth. But no matter how comfortable the surroundings were, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She wasn't here as a guest. She was part of a business deal, and that knowledge kept gnawing at her. In the following days, Leah tried her best to adjust to the new routine. Meals were served on time, and a team of doctors was brought in to conduct initial medical exams. As expected, Henry kept his distance. He was always busy, absorbed in his work, and only appeared occasionally to check the reports Stephanie gave him about Leah's progress. He never asked how she was feeling, and he rarely made time for any personal interaction. One afternoon, as Leah left a medical appointment, she crossed paths with Henry in the hallway. He was walking toward her with his usual stiff, calculated posture and an expression that showed no emotion. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice void of concern, more of a formal question than genuine interest. Leah paused, unsure how to respond. "Everything is as expected, I guess," she said flatly. Henry nodded curtly, not pressing further. However, before he walked away, he glanced at her one last time. "If you need anything, ask Stephanie. I want you to be well." Leah didn't know how to interpret that comment. Was it genuine kindness, or was he simply ensuring that everything went smoothly according to their agreement? She wasn't sure, but that brief exchange lingered in her mind, making her wonder if Henry's detached demeanor hid something more. Despite being treated with the utmost care, Leah couldn't ignore the turmoil within her. During one quiet evening, she stepped onto the balcony of her room and gazed out over the vast garden illuminated by moonlight. It was so peaceful, so distant from the harsh reality she had come from. The cold wind brushed against her skin, and she wrapped her arms around herself as if trying to shield herself from the uncertainty that lingered within. "Am I doing the right thing?" she thought, as doubts continued to swirl in her mind. Carrying a child and then giving it away. How could she handle that emotionally? The contract made it clear that she would have no rights to the child, but could she truly walk away from something so significant? Meanwhile, Henry was in his study reviewing the contract he had put in place with Leah. It was meticulous, precise, everything laid out to ensure that no part of the deal could be undone. He didn't like waiting, but he knew Leah was in no position to refuse. If she didn't accept his offer, he would simply move on to someone else. There was always another option. But a part of him couldn't shake his curiosity about Leah. Why had she accepted? Why had she agreed to this unusual arrangement? Later that day, Leah found herself in the living room browsing through a book she had found on a shelf. She wasn't particularly fond of classic literature, but the quietness of the room and the scent of old books provided a strange comfort. Just then, Henry walked in, holding a folder of documents in his hands, his demeanor distracted. "I didn't expect to find you here," he said, stopping in the middle of the room. Leah, not looking up from the book, responded with a sarcastic smile. "I didn't expect you to talk to me." Henry frowned, his gaze steady, but he didn't press the conversation. Instead, he placed the folder on the table and sat in the armchair nearby. "Are you settling in?" he asked, his voice still as controlled and impersonal as ever. "I think so," Leah replied cautiously, "but it still feels strange. It doesn't feel real." Henry leaned forward slightly, his expression not changing. "It does have to feel strange," he said. "This is a contract, Leah, an agreement. I assure you, everything will go exactly as planned." Leah met his gaze with defiance in her eyes. "That's what you do, isn't it? Plan everything, calculate everything, leave no room for mistakes." Henry didn't flinch. He was used to people underestimating him, to questioning his every move. "That's how I've built everything I have. Planning prevents failure." Leah shook her head, a short laugh escaping her. "Sometimes failure is inevitable. You can plan everything, but you can't control how you feel, Henry." Her words hit him harder than he expected. For a moment, he didn't respond. He leaned back in the chair, his thoughts lost in what she had said. Leah didn't push further. She stood up, grabbed the book from the shelf, and quietly left the room, leaving Henry to think. As the days passed, Leah continued to adjust to her new life in Henry's mansion. The mansion, grand and filled with luxury, felt alien to her. The expensive furniture, the pristine surroundings, they all screamed that this wasn't her place. But she followed the routine. Appointments, meals, medical checks. Despite the comfort, she couldn't shake the sense of emotional emptiness. She often found herself alone in her room, wondering about the life she had left behind. It wasn't much, but it had been hers. Now, everything felt out of control. The decision she had made haunted her, especially in the quiet of the night. Leah struggled with the emotional turmoil inside her, while Henry observed her from a distance. He kept his usual reserved demeanor, but couldn't help feeling a strange curiosity about her. Even in the midst of his busy schedule and endless meetings, he often found his thoughts drifting back to her. It wasn't emotional or romantic, at least not yet, but there was something about her that intrigued him. One afternoon, after a long day of meetings, Henry returned to the mansion. He found Leah sitting on a bench in the garden, her face tilted toward the sky, as if she were lost in thought. The peaceful scene before him was in stark contrast to the image he had of her. She'd always seemed so tough, so guarded, but here she was, alone and calm, in a place that felt far removed from the struggles of her past. For a moment, Henry hesitated, unsure if he should interrupt her solitude, but his curiosity won out and he walked over. "Enjoying the garden?" he asked in his usual direct, businesslike tone. Leah turned toward him, surprised but composed. "It's nice. Definitely better than the streets," she responded, her voice steady but edged with irony. He sat beside her, maintaining some distance but feeling oddly drawn to the quiet stillness between them. There was something disarming about Leah's honesty, something that made her seem more real than anyone he had encountered in a long time. "Are you settling in?" Henry asked after a long pause. Leah glanced at the flowers in front of her and shrugged. "It still feels strange, like I'm living someone else's life," she replied, her voice soft but resolute. Henry studied her for a moment, then answered, "It's all part of the agreement. I want you to have everything you need so everything goes as planned." "As planned?" she echoed, her tone sharp with irony. "Do you always live like this? Planning every second of your life?" He looked at her, a bit taken aback by her question. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone in her position. "Planning is what keeps everything running," Henry replied firmly. "Without it, everything falls apart." Leah gave a faint smile and shook her head. "I don't think everything can be controlled. Sometimes things just happen, whether you want them to or not." Her words hit him harder than he expected, unsettling him in a way he wasn't prepared for. He stood up abruptly, ending the conversation. "If you need anything, ask Stephanie," he said, his voice returning to its usual cold, detached tone. He turned and walked back inside, leaving Leah to contemplate his words. A few days later, Henry decided to accompany Leah to one of her medical appointments. He justified his decision by saying it was to ensure everything was going well, but deep down, he felt a growing sense of responsibility for the situation. Leah, on the other hand, wasn't surprised by his presence, but was curious about what it meant. He never seemed to care about anything beyond the contract, so why now? At the doctor's office, the usual tests were done, but this time, they heard the baby's heartbeat. Leah felt a wave of unexpected emotion as the sound echoed through the room. Her eyes filled with tears, but she quickly blinked them away, trying to maintain composure. Henry, on the other hand, remained still, his expression unreadable. But something in his gaze had shifted. That simple sound, the heartbeat of the child growing inside her, seemed to stir something inside him, a feeling he wasn't prepared to face. "Everything looks perfect," the doctor said with a smile. "You can start thinking about prenatal care and the next steps." Leah nodded, but Henry remained silent, lost in his thoughts. As they drove back to the mansion, the air between them was thick with unspoken words. Henry was visibly more contemplative, and Leah couldn't find the right words to fill the silence. When they arrived, Henry opened the car door for her, a small gesture that surprised her. "Thank you for today," Leah said quietly as she stepped out of the car. "It was the least I could do," Henry replied, not meeting her gaze. "I'll make sure everything continues to go well." Leah watched him walk back into the mansion, her mind racing with thoughts she couldn't quite articulate. There was something different about him, something that had shifted, though she couldn't yet grasp it. In the days that followed, Leah began to notice small changes in Henry's behavior. He appeared more frequently in the common areas of the house, and their conversations, though brief, seemed less distant, less transactional. He would ask about her medical appointments, how she was feeling, and even suggested things to help her relax. It wasn't much, but for the first time, it seemed like he was actually paying attention to her as a person. One evening, as they sat in silence at the large dining table, Henry broke the habit and asked, "Have you thought about what you want to do after all this is over?" Leah was taken aback by the question. It was the first time he had shown any interest in her future. "I don't have any plans," she replied honestly. "I still don't know what my life will be like after this." Henry nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You'll have the resources to start over wherever you want. Just make sure you do something worthwhile." Leah studied him, surprised by the genuine concern in his words. She didn't know how to interpret it, but for the first time, she didn't feel completely alone in the mansion. There was something in his tone that felt real, like he wasn't just playing a part in their contract. A few days later, Leah discovered a gift waiting for her at the entrance of her room. It was carefully wrapped with a small note attached. "To help with your free time." Inside was a brand new sketchbook and a set of high-quality pencils. Leah was speechless. She hadn't told Henry about her love for drawing, but during an earlier conversation, she'd mentioned it casually. never expecting him to remember, let alone care. Later that night, as she sat in the garden, Henry passed by and stopped for a moment. "Did you like the gift?" he asked, his voice casual but his eyes watching her closely. "Yes," Leah replied, holding the sketchbook. "Thank you. I didn't expect this." Henry gave a small shrug. "It seemed like something that could be good for you." Leah smiled, holding the gift more tightly. "It was," she replied simply. Leah began to realize that despite the comfort and luxury of her new life, the internal conflicts she was facing remained unresolved. Each day seemed to bring a new sense of emptiness, as if she were physically present but emotionally disconnected from everything around her. While Henry continued to maintain his firm, controlled exterior, Leah couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to him than he let on, a part of him he kept hidden, even from himself. One morning, Leah was taken aback by an unexpected request from Henry. He asked her to meet after breakfast, a gesture that seemed unusual given the distance he had maintained until now. When breakfast was over, Leah made her way to the sitting room, where Henry was already waiting next to a stack of paper that, "I need to discuss some additional details of the contract," he said matter-of-factly. Leah's heart sank. The last thing she wanted was more conditions. "More details? I thought everything was already settled." Henry studied her for a moment, his gaze cool and deliberate. "It's nothing that changes the terms. I just want to ensure you fully understand how things will unfold after the birth. I want to avoid any surprises." Leah took a deep breath, trying to keep her emotions in check. "I think I understand. I'll leave, and you'll go on with your life." He nodded slightly. "Yes, but I want you to know that if you need anything afterward, regardless of the agreement, I'll be available to help. I don't want you to feel abandoned." Leah raised an eyebrow, surprised by the unexpected offer. His tone was different, softer somehow, as if he were trying to show a level of consideration that hadn't been there before. "That's unexpected coming from you," she said, sarcasm slipping through her words. Henry merely shrugged, his face unreadable. "I don't want complications, and this is the best way to avoid them." Leah chuckled lightly, but there was something about the sincerity in his voice that made her pause. Maybe, just maybe, he was trying to be different, even if he didn't quite know how to. Later that day, Leah decided to explore the mansion further. The place was vast, almost overwhelming. Endless hallways, rooms filled with artwork and expensive furnishings. Everything screamed wealth and opulence. As she wandered through, she found herself drawn to a small study at the end of a hallway. The door was slightly ajar, and she could see Henry sitting at the desk. But he wasn't working. He was holding a framed photograph, staring at it with a pensive expression. Leah couldn't make out the details of the photo, but there was something in Henry's posture that caught her attention. It was the first time she had seen him look so vulnerable, so lost in thought. Hesitant, she knocked softly on the door. He quickly placed the photograph back on the desk, his expression hardening as he looked up at her. "Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt," she said, unsure of what to say next. "It's nothing," Henry replied, quickly masking his emotions. "Did you need something?" "No, I was just exploring the house," Leah said, her voice unsure. "You seemed like you were thinking about something important." Henry paused for a moment before answering. "We all have things we'd rather keep to ourselves." Sensing he didn't want to continue that conversation, Leah changed the subject. "This house is huge. Do you live here alone all the time?" He nodded, crossing his arms as he spoke. "It's more practical than it seems. I don't like distractions, and here I have the space I need." Leah studied him for a moment, trying to understand how someone could live surrounded by so much luxury and yet seem so lonely. "That must be strange," she said, her words slipping out before she could stop them. "Having all this but no one to share it with." Henry looked away, clearly uncomfortable with the question. "I'm used to it," he replied coldly. "I don't need anyone to do what I do." Leah wanted to believe him, but there was something in his tone that made her doubt his words. Before she could ask further, Henry stood up and abruptly ended the conversation. "If you need anything, Stephanie can help," he said, leaving no room for discussion. That evening, Leah went out to the mansion's terrace. The sky was clear, and the city lights twinkled in the distance. As she sat there, letting her thoughts wander, she found herself reflecting on the sound of the baby's heartbeat from her last doctor's appointment. That simple sound had affected her more deeply than she had expected. She had tried to keep her emotional distance, but it was becoming harder with each passing day. She didn't notice Henry approaching until she heard his footsteps. He stopped next to her, his tired face still maintaining the same rigid posture. "You like this spot, don't you?" he asked, his tone more curious than before. "I like the silence," Leah replied, her voice softer. "It helps me think." Henry paused for a moment, staring at the city lights before responding. "Thinking isn't always a good thing." Leah laughed, but it wasn't a laugh of joy. Try telling that to someone who spends most of their time alone. Henry didn't respond immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was unexpectedly soft. Sometimes being surrounded by people doesn't help much either. Leah glanced at him, sensing a sadness in his words that she hadn't noticed before. "Maybe you need something you can't control, Henry," she said, her words unfiltered. She didn't regret speaking her mind. He frowned as if wanting to respond but deciding against it. Instead, he turned and walked away, leaving Leah alone with her thoughts. Over the next few weeks, Leah realized that despite her best efforts, she couldn't maintain a solid emotional distance from Henry. He remained a mystery, his actions often contradictory. Yet there were moments, brief fragments, when his true self seemed to slip through the carefully constructed walls he had built around himself. She couldn't help but want to understand him, to know the man behind the cold, calculated businessman. At the same time, Henry found himself grappling with emotions he wasn't prepared for. When he had made the deal with Leah, he expected simplicity, control. But now, as he watched her, he began to see that things were far more complicated than he had anticipated. Leah wasn't just a pawn in his plan, and that realization terrified him. The following week, another checkup was scheduled. Leah woke up early, her stomach in knots. The months seemed to be flying by, and the idea of seeing her babies for the first time, even if it was only on a screen, filled her with both anxiety and excitement. She couldn't help but wonder if Henry would attend this appointment just as he had done the last time. When she entered the breakfast room, she found Henry and Stephanie discussing the day's schedule. "Ready?" Henry asked, glancing up from the folder of documents he was reviewing. "Ready enough," Leah replied, trying to sound calmer than she felt. "Great, we'll go together." His voice was firm, without any room for negotiation. Leah nodded and headed toward the car. The silence between them felt heavier than usual. Henry remained focused, as always, but there was something different about his demeanor. Maybe he was just as nervous as she was, though he would never admit it. At the doctor's office, the physician greeted them with a friendly smile, motioning for Leah to lie down on the exam table. He prepared the ultrasound equipment, explaining, "Today we'll get a clearer view of the baby." Leah braced herself as the doctor applied the cold gel to her abdomen. The transducer began to glide over her skin, and her breath caught in her chest, anxiety building as she tried to steady herself. Henry, standing next to her, crossed his arms and kept his gaze fixed on the monitor. Then the sound came, steady and strong, the rhythm of heartbeats. Not just one, but two. "Well, here's the surprise we couldn't see last time," the doctor said, pointing to the screen. "You're expecting twins." Leah's eyes widened in shock. She hadn't even considered the possibility of twins. A rush of emotion flooded her. Surprise, joy, and a sense of awe. Instinctively, she placed her hand on her belly, trying to process the news. Henry, standing by her side, was silent for a few seconds. His serious expression softened, and for the first time, Leah saw something she hadn't expected: genuine awe. He leaned in, focusing intently on the screen. "Two?" he asked quietly, almost as if needing confirmation. "Two," the doctor replied with a reassuring smile. "Both babies are healthy and growing well." The room fell silent save for the soft sound of the heartbeats echoing from the monitor. For Leah, the moment felt surreal, magical. No matter how hard she had tried to maintain emotional distance, she couldn't deny the bond she felt with the two lives growing inside her. Let's pause for a moment. To those who are still with me, type pizza in the comments. Only those who've read this far will understand. Now, back to the story. Henry, standing beside her, seemed equally moved, though he didn't speak. His eyes, usually so controlled, now revealed something deeper, something that couldn't be put into words. For the first time, he seemed vulnerable, touched by the reality of becoming a father to two children on the way. On the ride back to the mansion, the silence between them was different. It wasn't the usual cold, distant silence, but one filled with meaning, with thoughts unsaid. Leah broke the silence first, trying to ease the tension. "You don't seem like the kind of person who gets easily surprised," she commented, her voice light, but she couldn't hide the curiosity in her tone. Henry sighed, his focus still on the road ahead. "I'm not. But this..." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "This is different." Leah glanced at him, intrigued by the shift in his tone. "Is it scary?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Henry turned his head slightly to look at her. "No, it's impressive," he replied, his voice low but firm, "knowing that in a few months 2 new beings will be here depending on me." Leah felt a pang in her chest, a sudden ache. She realized how much she had already grown attached to the babies, and Henry's words made it even harder. She knew that eventually she would have to let them go, but hearing him speak with such care made her feel more connected to them than ever. "They also depend on me, at least for now," she said softly, trying to hold back the emotion in her voice. Henry nodded, his expression serious. "I know, and that's why I want to make sure you're okay, Leah, not just physically, but in every way that matters." Leah fell silent, absorbing the sincerity in his words. This was the first time Henry had spoken with such genuine concern, and it made her question everything she thought she knew about him. Later that evening, Leah found herself on the terrace, gazing out at the horizon. The sky was clear and the city lights shimmered in the distance. She sat there, her mind wandering, reflecting on the day's events. The sound of the baby's heartbeat still echoed in her mind. It was harder than ever to keep a distance, emotionally. Then she heard footsteps behind her. Leah turned to find Henry approaching, his posture still rigid, though there was a hint of hesitation in his step. "You like this spot, don't you?" he asked, his voice quiet as he stopped beside her. "I like the silence," Leah replied. "It helps me think." He stood next to her for a moment, staring at the city lights, then spoke. "Thinking isn't always a good thing." Leah let out a quiet laugh, though it wasn't entirely cheerful. Try telling that to someone who spends most of their time alone. Henry didn't respond right away. When he finally spoke, his voice had softened. "Sometimes being surrounded by people doesn't help much either." Leah turned to look at him, sensing the sadness in his words. "Maybe you need something you can't control, Henry," she said, speaking freely without thinking. She didn't regret it. He frowned as though wanting to respond but decided against it. Instead, he turned away and walked back inside, leaving Leah to process her thoughts. In the weeks that followed, Leah realized that despite her best efforts to keep her distance, she couldn't maintain a solid barrier between herself and Henry. He remained a puzzle, enigmatic and difficult to read, but there were moments when his true self slipped through, pieces of vulnerability that unsettled her. And while she tried to stay guarded, she couldn't help but feel drawn to him. Henry, too, found himself grappling with emotions he hadn't anticipated. When he first made the deal with Leah, he expected it to be simple, a transaction with clear terms and control. But now, as time went on, he realized that it wasn't just about the contract. Leah wasn't just a means to an end. She was making him feel things he wasn't prepared to face, and that terrified him. In the days that followed, the news about the twins brought an unexpected sense of lightness to the mansion. Stephanie began making adjustments to the nursery, which had originally been prepared for just one baby, now adapting it for two. Leah watched the changes with mixed emotions. The contract had made it clear that she would have to give up the babies, but deep down she realized that letting go would be much harder than she had ever imagined. As the preparations continued, both Leah and Henry began to see that the agreement that had initially seemed so straightforward was evolving into something far more complicated. The twins, still not born, were already reshaping their lives in ways neither of them had anticipated. In the weeks following the revelation of the twins, there was a subtle shift in the dynamic between Leah and Henry. Despite his usual methodical and reserved nature, small gestures began to surface, showing a side of him that Leah hadn't expected. One afternoon after a medical appointment, Henry insisted on escorting her to the car, something he would normally leave to Stephanie or another staff member. "Are you okay?" he asked, holding the car door open for her. Leah was taken aback, surprised by the simple kindness. "Yes, I'm fine. Thank you for asking." Henry nodded, but as he got into the car, there was a momentary silence between them. Leah couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting. Despite her initial reservations, Henry seemed genuinely concerned about her well-being. Back at the mansion, Leah noticed more signs of change. One day she walked into her room to find a new set of pillows and blankets on the bed, accompanied by a small note that read, "To help you rest better." The gesture, though small, made her smile. It wasn't the lavish luxury that had become her daily reality, but something more personal, more thoughtful. Later that day, as she was sipping tea in the living room, Henry entered and quietly sat in the armchair opposite her. He looked more relaxed than usual, though his usual serious demeanor was still intact. "Did you like the gift in your room?" he asked bluntly. "Yes, I did," Leah replied, studying him curiously. "It was thoughtful of you." Henry frowned slightly, as if he wasn't entirely sure how to respond. "Good. I want to make sure you're comfortable. That's important to me." Leah couldn't help but notice the shift in him, but there was still a part of her that remained guarded. She felt the need to speak her mind. "You're changing, Henry, or at least it seems that way, but I still don't know why," she said directly. Henry stared at her for a moment, as if weighing his words. Finally, he sighed. "Maybe you're right. Maybe I am changing. But the truth is, I don't know how to be different. I'm not used to caring." His admission surprised both of them. It was rare for Henry to show any vulnerability, but there he was, revealing something he had always kept hidden behind his controlled exterior. That night, Leah sat on the terrace, looking out at the stars, reflecting on the conversation. Henry was not the man she had imagined him to be. Though he remained difficult to figure out, she could sense there was more to him than his cold, businesslike demeanor. She wasn't sure if that was a good thing or a bad thing, but it made her wonder what else lay beneath the surface. The weeks that followed continued to bring small but significant changes. Henry remained outwardly the same, firm, calculating. But Leah started noticing subtle differences in his behavior. They were spending more time together, and he had started to show an interest in the details of her life. He asked about her well-being, offered help with the twins' preparations, and seemed more aware of her needs. His once impenetrable exterior was starting to soften, and Leah couldn't help but take notice. Yet despite these changes, a part of her remained cautious. She had been hurt before, and trusting someone again felt like a risk she wasn't sure she was ready to take. One morning, Henry joined Leah for breakfast, which had become a rare occurrence. The air between them was calm, and for the first time in a while, it felt easy. They sipped their coffee in silence until Henry finally spoke. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice softer than usual, "about the future. about what comes next. Leah set her cup down and looked at him, intrigued by his words. "What do you mean?" "I mean, after all this," he continued, his tone open and almost vulnerable, "I want us to build something real, not just for the twins, but for us. For our future." Leah was taken aback. This was a side of Henry she hadn't seen before, someone who was thinking about something beyond the immediate future, someone considering what it would mean to have a life beyond contracts and agreements. "Are you sure about this?" she asked quietly, unsure of how to process what he was offering. "What happens when things get tough?" Henry met her gaze and nodded, his eyes sincere. "I've been through a lot in my life. I've never let anyone get close, but I think I need that now. I need someone to share everything with, and I want that to be you, Leah." Leah felt a surge of emotions, but she quickly pushed them aside, not allowing herself to get carried away. She had to protect herself. "You don't have to make any decisions now," Henry added, as if reading her thoughts. "I just wanted you to know how I feel." Leah nodded but said nothing. She wasn't sure if she was ready for this kind of change, but a part of her wanted to believe that something more than just survival was possible between them. For the first time in a long while, she felt the possibility of something deeper than a business transaction, something that could become real. As the days passed, the reality of the twins' arrival settled in. The nursery, which had once been prepared for one baby, was now ready for two. A sense of anticipation filled the mansion, and though Leah had always known what her part in the agreement was, she couldn't help but feel more connected to the babies growing inside her. She was realizing just how much she had come to care for them and how much harder it would be to part with them once they were born. The day of the twins' birth arrived, bringing with it a whirlwind of excitement and anxiety. Henry, as always, stood by her side, maintaining his usual calm demeanor. But today, there was a difference in him. His concern for Leah was visible, and it comforted her in a way she hadn't expected. After hours of labor, the moment finally came. The first cry echoed through the room, filling the air with the sound of a healthy baby boy. The doctor smiled, gently placing him in a crib nearby. Moments later, a second cry filled the room, confirming that the second baby was a girl. Leah's emotions overwhelmed her as she looked at the tiny beings, knowing that they would forever be a part of her life. Henry, too, seemed deeply moved. For the first time, he understood the magnitude of what was happening. He held both children, his usual reserved expression softened by genuine awe. "They're perfect," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Leah nodded, tears streaming down her face as she held her son in her arms. The room was filled with love, but there was also the looming reality that soon, once the babies were healthy, she would have to leave them behind. Over the next few days, Leah and Henry adjusted to their new roles as parents. The house was chaotic, but there were moments of joy and laughter. Henry, though awkward at first, learned to change diapers, prepare bottles, and even sing lullabies, his gruff voice surprisingly comforting. One evening, as they sat on the couch with the twins, peacefully asleep nearby, Henry turned to Leah with a serious expression. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice soft. Leah looked up from the twins, intrigued. "What about?" "I want us to be a real family, not just because of the twins, but because I want you by my side forever," Henry continued, his words carrying weight. Leah's breath caught. She had never expected him to say this, and hearing it left her uncertain about what to feel. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Henry met her gaze and nodded. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life. I know it won't be easy and I've made mistakes, but I want to build something with you, something real, not based on contracts or obligations, but on love." Leah sat still, her emotions swirling. Henry had always been a man of logic, someone who calculated everything down to the last detail. But now, here he was, speaking from the heart, opening himself to her in a way she never expected. She looked down at the twins, and for the first time in a long time, a sense of peace washed over her. Maybe, just maybe, they could build something real together. A few weeks later, an intimate ceremony was held in the mansion's garden. Only a handful of close friends and staff were invited, including Stephanie, who had become an important part of their journey. The day was perfect. Sunshine bathed the scene, and a gentle breeze rustled the flowers that decorated the venue. Leah wore a simple, elegant dress, and Henry looked sharp in his suit. The twins, dressed adorably, were held by Stephanie, who had tears in her eyes. When Henry and Leah exchanged vows, they spoke from their hearts. Henry promised to be the man she deserved, always standing by her side, no matter what. Leah, in turn, promised to trust him and help him become the best version of himself. As they stood embracing, holding the twins, Stephanie's voice broke the silence. "You make a beautiful family." For the first time, Henry, Leah, and the babies were exactly where they were meant to be. Life after the ceremony wasn't without its challenges, but it was filled with moments of joy. Henry and Leah worked together to create a warm, loving home for the twins. They learned the joys and struggles of parenthood, facing sleepless nights and the constant demands with a mix of exhaustion and happiness. One night, as Leah was putting the twins to bed, Henry appeared at the door of their bedroom. Without saying a word, he walked up to her and wrapped her in a tight embrace. "Thank you for not giving up on me," he said, his voice soft. Leah hugged him back, feeling the weight of the moment. "Thank you for showing me I could trust again," she replied. Months later, on a sunny afternoon, Henry and Leah sat in the garden, watching the twins play on a soft mat in the grass. The sound of their laughter filled the air, an infectious joy that spread throughout the garden. Leah looked over at Henry, who was sitting beside her with a smile on his face. "Are you happy?" she asked, genuinely curious. Henry glanced at her, then at the twins, before replying. "I never thought I could be this happy," he said. "You've given me more than I ever knew I needed. Leah, a family, a purpose, love." Leah smiled, feeling a peace she hadn't experienced in a long time. "And you've shown me that love can be built, even through challenges. Thank you for that." As they leaned in for a gentle kiss, the twins began to babble something that sounded like "Mama" and "Dada." Henry and Leah laughed, overwhelmed by emotion, as they moved closer to the babies, enveloping them in all the love they had. That moment, simple yet profound, was proof they had found something real. It wasn't a perfect life, but it was full of love, understanding, and hope. And that was all they needed to move